The night was still, quiet, and cold. The soft hum of streetlights echoed in the empty streets of Arlington, Virginia. It was a peaceful, ordinary night, or so it seemed. Talia Porter, a confident woman with a purpose, drove through the neighborhood in her sleek black SUV. The rhythmic hum of her car's engine was the only sound that accompanied her as she maneuvered around the bends in the road. It was just past midnight, and Talia was ready to head home after a long day. But little did she know, tonight would change everything. Talia had been in this town for weeks, working undercover on an assignment she couldn't speak about. The adrenaline of her job, the thrill of staying one step ahead, had become a way of life. But tonight, she felt a rare calm, as if everything was falling into place. The quiet streets seemed to match her mood. She looked at her watch. There was still time before she had to go back to the base. Her mission was nearing its end, and she had collected enough information to expose the corruption that had been festering under the surface of the police department. She approached an intersection, the faint glint of the stop sign catching her eye. Talia was always alert, always aware of the details around her. She slowed down, coming to a complete stop, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. It was a habit that had been drilled into her through years of training. Nothing was ever as it seemed, and she never took any chances. As she turned left, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Suddenly, the familiar blue and red lights flashed in her mirror. The sound of the siren pierced the stillness of the night. Her heart didn't race, though. She was trained for moments like this. Years of experience had taught her to stay calm, to never let fear control her actions. She glanced in the rearview mirror again. The police car was right behind her now, its headlights casting long shadows on the dark road ahead. The sound of the siren grew louder, but Talia remained unshaken. She knew the routine: pull over, turn off the engine, and retrieve her documents. That was all she needed to do. But there was something about this stop that felt different. Something wasn't right. She guided her SUV to the side of the road, the tires crunching on the gravel. As she switched off the engine, she reached for the glove compartment. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, pulling out her license and registration. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She knew the procedure by heart. The patrol car stopped behind her, the lights flashing in her mirrors. Talia took a deep breath, keeping her nerves in check. There was no reason to panic. She had nothing to hide. Two officers stepped out of the patrol car, their movements precise. The tall, broad-shouldered officer with a square jaw approached first. Officer Carter. Talia had trained herself to observe every detail about the people she encountered. His uniform gleamed under the streetlights, his badge shining brightly. Behind him, a shorter, stockier officer, Mark Sullivan, followed closely. The two of them seemed to work like a well-oiled machine, their movements in sync. Officer Carter leaned down and shone his flashlight into Talia's car. The beam swept across her face and the interior of the vehicle. He didn't seem to find anything out of the ordinary, but that didn't stop him from asking, "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Talia remained calm, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "No, officer," she replied evenly. "I wasn't speeding, and I made a full stop at the intersection." Carter's lips twisted into a small, almost condescending smile. "Actually, you failed to stop at that sign back there," he said, his voice hardening. "That's a moving violation." Talia's brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't let it show. She knew she had stopped at the sign. She was sure of it. "I'm certain I stopped, officer," she said, her tone polite but firm. She had been driving long enough to know when something didn't add up. But she didn't argue. That wasn't her style. Instead, she kept her focus on the situation at hand. Carter's eyes narrowed as if searching for something more. "License and registration," he barked, cutting her off before she could finish her sentence. Talia handed him the documents, her movements slow and controlled. She didn't feel fear, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't just a simple traffic stop. As Carter stepped back, he exchanged a glance with Officer Sullivan. The brief moment of eye contact was enough for Talia to know something was wrong. These officers weren't just doing their job. They were looking for something. The question was, what were they after? Talia's heart remained steady, but her mind raced. Something was happening here. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just about a traffic violation. This was something bigger. She had no idea how right she was. The minutes dragged on, the silence in the air thick with tension. Officer Carter glanced at Sullivan, then back at Talia. "Wait here," he ordered before turning back to his car. The situation was becoming more strange by the second. Why had they stopped her? Why were they taking so long with her papers? It was just a simple stop, or at least, that's what it should have been. Talia's mind raced, but she kept her cool. She had been in tough situations before. She knew how to handle herself. But as she sat there, waiting, she couldn't shake the feeling that this night wasn't going to end the way she expected. In the back of her mind, a single thought echoed. This is only the beginning. Talia sat still in her SUV, her fingers lightly gripping the steering wheel, but her mind was racing. The eerie silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind and the hum of streetlights above. She watched through the rearview mirror as the officers moved around their squad car, speaking in low tones, their faces unreadable. She had seen these kinds of stops before. It was standard procedure for her work. Police pulling over a car in the middle of the night, giving a ticket or warning, and then moving on. But something felt off tonight, off in a way that made her skin prickle and her instincts buzz with unease. These officers weren't just making a routine stop. They were waiting for something. She glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It had been minutes since they'd gone back to their patrol car. Most officers would have returned by now with a ticket or an apology if they were mistaken. But these men were still lingering. The silence felt too thick. And that was the problem. She wasn't sure what was coming next. Talia shifted slightly in her seat, looking over her shoulder once more. Officer Carter was pacing around his car now, his eyes scanning the empty street like he was waiting for something. Someone else. Officer Sullivan stood nearby, hands in his pockets, looking at the ground. It didn't take long for Talia to notice how stiff they were, as if they were trying to keep a secret. She knew that feeling. She had felt it herself when she was trying to stay under the radar. But there was no reason for these officers to act this way. Or was there? Suddenly, Carter returned to her window, his face colder now, more serious than before. Talia's eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't just a woman driving home after a long day. She wasn't just another target on their list. No, she was trained to see through the cracks in the facade. And right now, everything about this situation screamed setup. "Ma'am, we need you to step out of the vehicle," Officer Carter said in a voice that was almost too calm. His words hung in the air, heavy and laced with something Talia couldn't place. It wasn't a request. It was an order. And in that instant, she realized the trap was closing around her. "Step out of the vehicle," she repeated quietly, but her voice held a sharpness that betrayed the calm exterior she was trying to maintain. Carter nodded slowly. His partner, Sullivan, took a step closer, his eyes fixed on her without blinking. Talia's thoughts raced, running through all the possible outcomes. She could feel the weight of the situation shift in the pit of her stomach. Something wasn't right. She had seen enough of these moments to know when they weren't playing by the book. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Her words were slow, measured. She didn't want to give anything away, not even a hint of fear. "Just do as we ask, please," Carter insisted, his voice flat, almost mechanical now. Talia's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but she didn't move. She wasn't about to give them an inch, not when she was so close to the end of this mission. If they wanted her out of the car, they were going to have to make her move. She didn't break eye contact, her expression cool and composed. "What's this about, really?" she asked, her voice cutting through the thick tension like a knife. She wasn't sure what game these officers were playing, But she wasn't going to be their pawn. Not tonight. Carter's lips pressed into a tight line. We have reason to believe you're involved in something more than just a simple traffic violation, he said, his words loaded with unspoken meaning. The tension in the air was palpable, as if both men were waiting for her to react, to give something away. Talia kept her expression neutral. She wasn't just any woman on the street tonight. She wasn't just a victim of bad luck. She was someone trained to handle situations like this, someone who knew the stakes. But the question lingered. Why had they singled her out? Why did it feel like she had walked into something far bigger than herself? The silence between them stretched again. The clock on her dashboard seemed to tick louder now, counting down to something she wasn't sure she was ready for. She kept her eyes on Carter and Sullivan, watching their every move, analyzing every detail. There was something more beneath the surface, something they weren't telling her. As she sat there, her mind whirring, it hit her. These weren't just random cops pulling over a woman in the middle of the night. They were part of something much darker, something that involved her, something she had yet to uncover. Her training kicked in. This wasn't a traffic stop. This wasn't just about a violation. These officers were trying to set her up. They wanted her to make a mistake, to give them a reason to escalate things further. And if they thought she was just a regular woman, they were gravely mistaken. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. The trap was set, and Talia could feel it tightening. But there was still one thing they didn't know. Talia Porter wasn't just a woman they had pulled over. She was someone who had the power to turn their world upside down. And she would. With one small but deliberate action, Talia made her move. The game had just begun. Talia stepped out of the car with deliberate calm, her movements smooth and controlled. As she closed the door behind her, she could feel the eyes of the officers on her, watching, calculating, waiting for a misstep. But Talia had been in much higher-stakes situations than this. The look she gave them was one of quiet confidence, the kind that only comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of. Officer Carter took a step forward, his flashlight shining brightly in her face. She blinked slightly, the light blinding for a moment. But she didn't flinch. He had to know that his intimidation wouldn't work on her, no matter how hard he tried. She had faced far worse. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood of the car," Carter ordered, his voice now sharp and laced with authority. But Talia didn't immediately obey. She stood there, facing the officers, her eyes locked on Carter's, measuring his every word, every movement. "Why exactly am I being detained, officer?" she asked, her voice cold but steady. There was no panic, no fear in her tone, just an icy calm that sent a chill through the night air. Carter hesitated for just a second. Sullivan, standing slightly behind him, shifted on his feet, his hand inching closer to his sidearm. Talia's sharp eyes caught the movement, and it told her everything she needed to know. These men were nervous. They were trying to act like they were in control, but she could see it now. This wasn't about a simple traffic stop. They were hiding something. "Just do as we ask, Mom," Carter repeated, a little more forcefully this time. Talia didn't move. She was calculating her options, weighing the risks. If she complied, they would have the upper hand. But if she resisted, they would escalate. She had to be careful. Any wrong move, and the game could change in an instant. "I've been pulled over," Talia said slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "For a traffic violation. And now you're telling me to get out of my car and put my hands on the hood. What's going on here, officer? What aren't you telling me?" There was a long pause. The air seemed to thicken with tension, like something big was about to happen. Carter and Sullivan exchanged a quick glance, but neither of them spoke. Talia could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't just about a small-town police stop. This was something deeper, something they were desperately trying to cover up. Then, without warning, Carter took a step back, his face twisted in a smug expression. "You don't get to ask the questions here," he said, his voice colder now, almost dismissive. But Talia wasn't intimidated. If anything, His words only made her more determined to get to the truth. She had been trained for moments like this. Moments when the world around you seemed to tilt off balance, and you had to fight to regain control. "I'm not going to let you frame me," Talia said quietly, almost under her breath, but her words were heavy with meaning. Her eyes were locked onto Carter's, and she saw the flicker of something like doubt, cross his face. Carter's expression hardened. "I said, turn around." Talia's heart was pounding, but her face remained a mask of calm. She knew what was coming next, and she wasn't about to make it easy for them. They wanted to provoke her, to get her to make a mistake. But Talia had learned long ago that the best way to handle this kind of situation was to stay one step ahead. Before either of the officers could react, Talia's phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't reach for it immediately, but her heart skipped a beat. It was the kind of distraction she needed. Carter, clearly irritated, motioned for her to keep moving. Sullivan, who had been standing still, now took a step closer, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. He was trying to corner her, trying to make her feel trapped. Talia didn't respond to the officer's commands. Instead, she slowly reached for her phone and glanced at the message. The words on the screen were like a bolt of lightning to her system. "Backup is on the way. Stay calm. We've got you." Her mind clicked into overdrive. Her team was already aware of what was going on. They knew this was coming, and now Talia could finally see the full scope of the trap she had been lured into. It was much bigger than she had anticipated. These officers weren't just trying to make her a scapegoat. They were part of a much larger operation, a network of corruption that stretched far beyond this small Virginia town. Talia took a deep breath, letting the message sink in. It was time to flip the script. She wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. She wasn't just a woman they could push around. She was trained, and she was ready. "Tell me what's really going on," Talia said, her voice no longer soft. There was a sharpness to it now, a hint of authority that she had carefully crafted. "You know who I am, don't you?" Carter's jaw clenched. Sullivan stepped closer, and for the first time, Talia saw the fear in his eyes. They weren't sure what she knew, and that uncertainty was exactly what she needed. "Turn around now, or we'll make you," Carter snapped. But Talia stood her ground. This wasn't just about this moment anymore. It was about something much bigger. And the truth, the ugly, dangerous truth, was going to come out, whether they liked it or not. The tension in the air grew thicker with every passing second. Talia could feel the weight of the officers' glares on her, but she stood tall, her eyes unwavering. The sirens that had blared so loudly just moments before now seemed distant, almost like an echo of a world she no longer belonged to. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It was the beginning of something much more sinister. Talia's phone buzzed again in her pocket, but she didn't take her eyes off Carter. She wasn't going to let him see her flinch. She wasn't going to give him any satisfaction. With a calculated move, she pulled her phone from her pocket, glancing down at the screen. The message was short, but it was everything she needed to know. "They know. Be ready." The words hit her like a spark to dry tinder. Her team was already on the move. She was no longer alone in this fight, but the moment was still far from over. Carter and Sullivan were playing a dangerous game, and they had no idea who they were really dealing with. "I'm not playing your game, officer," Talia said, her voice steady and firm. "I'm not the one you want." Carter's eyes narrowed, his patience running thin. "I told you to turn around." Talia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him, reading the small, almost imperceptible signs of unease in his posture. The way his hand twitched near his sidearm. The subtle way he took a half step back, as if trying to keep some distance between them. Sullivan, on the other hand, was closer now, his posture stiff, his eyes darting nervously. They weren't used to someone like Talia, someone who didn't react to fear. "Do you know who I am?" Talia asked, her voice dropping low but steady. For a split second, Carter hesitated. It was almost unnoticeable, but Talia saw it. She could read people like a book, and she knew that, in that brief moment, Carter's mind was racing. He had heard something about her. He wasn't sure what it was, but he could feel it in his gut. That strange, unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. But he didn't back down. Not yet. "Turn around and put your hands on the hood now," Carter repeated, his voice rising slightly. Talia tilted her head slightly, her expression one of quiet understanding. She knew what he was doing. He was trying to control the situation, trying to force her to submit. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. She wasn't going to be intimidated. "You're making a mistake," Talia said, her tone calm, almost as if she was speaking to a child who didn't understand the gravity of what was happening. Carter's jaw clenched, and he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He was no longer just trying to intimidate her. He was testing her, trying to see how far he could push her before she cracked. But Talia wasn't someone who cracked. "You don't know who you're messing with," Carter spat, his voice laced with anger. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Talia could feel the shift. Carter's confidence was beginning to crumble. She had just hit a nerve. His voice was no longer smooth, no longer in control. The moment of uncertainty was brief, but it was enough for Talia to capitalize on. She wasn't just any woman. She was a CIA agent, and she had been in much worse situations than this. "I know exactly who you are," Talia said, her voice unwavering. "And I know exactly what you've been doing." There was a flicker of something in Carter's eyes, a mix of fear and disbelief. Sullivan, who had been standing off to the side, now stepped forward, his hand still hovering near his weapon. He was nervous, uncertain, and Talia knew it. They were starting to realize that she wasn't someone they could easily overpower. "You have no idea who you're messing with," Carter repeated, his tone growing more hostile. He was desperate now, his control slipping with every word. Talia met his gaze with a calmness that made his insides twist. "I'm not the one in danger here. You are." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Carter took a step back, looking at Sullivan for backup. The moment had shifted entirely. The officers were no longer sure of themselves, and Talia was ready. Just then, the sound of distant sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. Talia's heart raced, but she kept her cool. She wasn't going to make a move until the time was right. As the patrol car's lights flickered in the distance, Carter glanced over his shoulder, his expression one of frustration and fear. The backup had arrived, but it wasn't the kind of backup he had been hoping for. Talia's team was here. "Get back in the car," Carter barked, his voice trembling with anger. He was clearly trying to regain some semblance of control, but it was too late. The truth was already unraveling. "I think I'll stay right here," Talia replied, her voice calm and measured. The officers now looked at each other nervously. They had pushed her too far, and now the trap they had set for her was slowly crumbling, piece by piece. And Talia, standing tall and resolute, knew that the truth would soon be exposed. Talia stood still, her eyes never leaving the officers, as the sirens from the backup units drew nearer. The air was thick with tension, the faint hum of the city streets now drowned out by the anticipation of what was to come. Officer Carter was no longer the confident man who had approached her moments before. His gaze flickered nervously between her and the approaching reinforcements, his mind racing to make sense of everything that was happening. Officer Sullivan, too, was unsettled. His hands were trembling ever so slightly as he kept his hand near his gun, a nervous habit he couldn't shake. They had tried to frame her, tried to accuse her of a crime she hadn't committed. But now something was wrong. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. The distant sound of approaching sirens grew louder, a signal that the moment of reckoning was nearly here. Talia could feel her heartbeat quicken, not out of fear, but from the knowledge that the storm she had been preparing for was finally coming to a head. The web of lies and corruption that had been spun was about to unravel, and she was right in the center of it. "Stay in the car," Carter barked once more, his voice strained. The command, however, was more a plea now than an order. He needed to regain control, but Talia wasn't going to make it easy for him. She wasn't some woman on the side of the road who could be intimidated or bullied into submission. She was trained. She had the power to expose everything, and she wasn't about to let these officers win. Talia stood firm, her back straight, her eyes unwavering. She could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet before the storm, and she knew she had to act. The time for subtlety was over. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her voice low but clear. The officers exchanged another glance, confusion evident in their eyes. But Talia wasn't just talking about the traffic stop. She was talking about everything they had tried to hide. The corruption that ran deep within the police force, the racism that stained their actions, the lies they told to cover up their mistakes. "I don't want any trouble," Carter muttered, though the words didn't carry the same authority they once had. Talia could hear the crack in his voice, the guilt and fear slipping through his carefully crafted facade. The moment of truth was here. The officers knew it, and so did she. "You're already in too deep," Talia replied, her tone unwavering. Her words were meant to unsettle them, to make them realize that they were now the ones in danger. She wasn't just a woman they had pulled over for a minor traffic violation. She was a CIA agent, and she had the power to expose everything. Just as the backup cars skidded to a halt behind the patrol car, the officers began to realize their mistake. It was too late to cover it up now. The truth was out in the open, and Talia knew that everything they had planned was falling apart. The lies they had crafted to justify their actions no longer held any weight. "Look," Sullivan started, his voice shaky, but Talia cut him off. "Don't even try to explain yourself," she said, her voice cold, but calm. "You've already shown your hand." The approaching backup officers had now surrounded them, their faces filled with confusion as they took in the scene. They were trained to handle situations like this, but they weren't prepared for what was unfolding before them. The officers on the ground, Carter and Sullivan, had been caught in a lie, and now they were paying the price. Talia could feel the eyes of the new officers on her, and she knew that this was the moment everything would change. The truth wasn't just going to be revealed in a courtroom. It was happening right here, right now, on the side of this quiet Virginia street. The backup officers started to take control of the situation, moving in to speak with Carter and Sullivan. Talia could see the shift in power, the once authoritative officers now unsure of what to do. The trap they had set for her was no longer theirs to control. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying the price. Talia watched as Carter, his face pale, began to explain the situation, but his words faltered. He was trying to cover up his actions, but it was clear to anyone listening that his words didn't carry the same weight they once did. The backup officers weren't buying it, and Talia could feel the satisfaction bubbling up inside her. For a moment, she allowed herself a small smile. The officers who had framed her, who had tried to ruin her life, were now standing at the edge of their own downfall. The truth was out, and they couldn't hide from it. "You won't get away with this," Carter muttered, his face red with frustration. But Talia wasn't fazed. His words were meaningless now. "I don't need to," she said, her voice steady, almost detached. "You've already lost." As the backup officers took control, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The truth was clear now. Talia Porter wasn't just a random woman on the side of the road. She was a trained CIA operative, and the corruption these officers had been trying to cover up was no longer something they could hide. With the backup units moving in to arrest Carter and Sullivan, Talia took a step back. The battle wasn't over yet, but this was a victory for justice, a victory for the truth. And as the scene unfolded, Talia couldn't help but feel the weight of the words that had been said earlier. "You've already lost." She was right. The truth was on her side, and no one, not even the most powerful people in the system, could stop it now. The calm of the quiet street had long since disappeared. Now, the air was thick with the energy of a truth about to be exposed, a reckoning that was both inevitable and long overdue. Talia stood by as the backup officers took over, their faces grim as they processed the scene unfolding before them. Carter and Sullivan were in the grips of their own guilt, each of them attempting to save face in the face of the storm they had just unleashed. Talia's steady gaze flickered over to the squad cars as the sirens, now muted, signaled the arrival of even more units. She had been trained for moments like this, moments when the truth would rise above the lies, when the corrupt would finally be held accountable. But even with her years of experience, nothing could prepare her for the weight of what was about to unfold. In the background, Carter was speaking frantically, trying to justify his actions, but his words held no power. His badge was a symbol of authority, but it was no longer enough to shield him from the consequences of his choices. The backup officers, now fully aware of the situation, moved with purpose. They moved to arrest the two officers who had so carelessly attempted to frame an innocent woman. But it wasn't just about the two officers now. It was about something much larger, something that would rock the entire department to its core. Talia's heart beat with a slow, controlled rhythm. She wasn't here to punish these men. She was here to expose the corruption they represented, to shine a light on the dark corners of the system that had allowed this injustice to take root. And as the handcuffs clicked onto Carter and Sullivan's wrists, she knew that the story was far from over. In a small, quiet town like Arlington, it would be easy for this to be swept under the rug. It would be easy for the story to fade away, and for the officers to get away with their actions. But not this time. Not when the truth was too big to ignore. And certainly not when Talia Porter was involved. One of the backup officers, a woman with dark eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, stepped forward, her voice sharp as she addressed Carter and Sullivan. "You two are under arrest for corruption, misconduct, and attempted framing. You'll be processed at the station," she said, her eyes cold with resolve. She motioned for her colleagues to escort the officers toward the squad car. But Carter, who had been holding on to the last shred of pride, suddenly broke. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Carter spat, his voice shaking. "This is bigger than you think. You don't know who you're messing with." Talia didn't flinch. She had heard these kinds of threats before. Empty, desperate attempts to intimidate and control. But she wasn't afraid. The truth was her ally, and it always would be. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Talia replied, her voice calm and steady. "And it's over. You're finished." The backup officer glanced at Talia, a brief look of respect passing between them. She had been following the case from the shadows, knowing that Talia was more than just a civilian caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been a target in a web of lies, and the officers who had tried to set her up were now paying the price for their actions. As Carter and Sullivan were loaded into the back of the squad car, the atmosphere in the street shifted. The once tense energy of the confrontation was replaced with a solemn quiet as the backup officers began to process the gravity of the situation. Word would get around fast, and Arlington's police department would never be the same. But it wasn't just the officers who were being held accountable. This was a turning point, a moment that could change the course of the future. Talia had brought her training, her resolve, and her knowledge to this quiet town. And in doing so, she had exposed something far larger than the corruption of two officers. She had exposed a system that had been failing for far too long, one that had allowed racism, injustice, and abuse of power to thrive. Talia took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the scene. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The case was just beginning, and there were still many questions to answer. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a small moment of relief. The battle had been fought, and the first step toward justice had been taken. As the squad car with the arrested officers disappeared into the distance, Talia turned to the backup officer who had spoken earlier. "Thank you for your help," she said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. The officer nodded, her expression unreadable. "We'll make sure the truth gets out. You've done more for this town than anyone knows." Talia gave a small nod, the weight of the night still lingering on her shoulders. But she knew this was only the beginning. The truth was on its way, and the consequences of these men's actions would soon reverberate across the entire police force. There was no turning back now. As the night gave way to the early morning light, Talia knew that the hardest part was still to come. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. And as long as she had breath in her lungs, she would continue to fight. For herself, for those who couldn't fight, and for the truth that would always rise above the lies. The storm was over for now, but the battle for justice had only just begun. The first rays of dawn broke through the skyline, casting a pale light over the streets of Arlington. It was a new day, but the events of the night had left their mark, forever changing the town and its police department. The confrontation had been explosive, and the aftermath was just beginning to take shape. Talia stood alone at the edge of the now empty street, the air still heavy with the tension of what had just transpired. The officers who had framed her were in custody, their careers in ruins. But Talia knew the fight was far from over. This was just the beginning of something much bigger, a battle for justice that would require more than just the fall of 2 officers. It would take the collapse of an entire system of corruption. As she looked at the first light of morning, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. The truth had been exposed, but the fight to ensure it was acknowledged, to make sure the system was held accountable, was far from simple. It was easy to stop a few bad apples, but the rot went deeper, and the work needed to uproot it would take years. Talia's mind shifted back to the court proceedings that would soon follow. The courtroom was where everything would be laid bare, where the truth would be tried in front of the very people who had once stood behind the officers responsible for the injustice. She could already imagine the reaction of the community, the shock, the anger, the disbelief. The truth always had a way of forcing people to confront the darkness they tried so hard to ignore. But even as the thought of the battle in the courtroom loomed over her, Talia knew that the people she had worked alongside, the investigators and the backup officers, were already moving to ensure that justice would be done. They had seen the truth. They knew what had happened, and they were going to make sure it would be shared with everyone, no matter how high up the chain the corruption went. The quiet town of Arlington had suddenly been thrust into the spotlight, and there would be no escaping the consequences of what had taken place. But that wasn't just on the officers who had tried to frame her. It was on everyone who had turned a blind eye to the systemic issues that had allowed such corruption to thrive for so long. In the days following the arrest, Talia met with the district attorney, her nerves steeled by the weight of the case ahead. The DA's office had already received the evidence, and they knew the stakes. But Talia also knew that nothing was guaranteed. Corruption ran deep, and the road to justice was never a straight one. As the investigation into the officers' misconduct expanded, more names came to light. Those who had once been untouchable were now under scrutiny. The news media picked up the story, spreading it far and wide. The story of the black woman framed by 2 white officers had captured the public's attention, and it was no longer just about Talia. It was about the community as a whole. It was about systemic racism, about corruption in law enforcement, and about the need for change. The trial, when it came, was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with media, family, and community members. The defense attorneys for Carter and Sullivan tried their best to deflect and minimize the charges, but the evidence was undeniable. Witness testimonies, surveillance footage, and the clear pattern of false accusations against Talia all painted a damning picture. The officers tried to argue that their actions were justified, but it was clear that they had overstepped. The truth was too powerful to be silenced. Talia sat in the front row of the courtroom, her heart pounding as the trial unfolded. She had been prepared for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the raw emotion of it all. She had come to the small town of Arlington with a mission, and now, in the cold, hard light of the courtroom, she could see the fruits of her labor. The corrupt officers were being held accountable, and the truth was being laid bare for the world to see. The final verdict came down swiftly, a unanimous decision that the officers were guilty of all charges. Carter and Sullivan were sentenced to prison for their actions, and the community of Arlington was left to pick up the pieces of the shattered trust that had once existed between them and their police department. But for Talia, the victory was bittersweet. She had done her part, exposed the truth, and brought the officers to justice. But the scars left by their actions, the pain of the injustice she had suffered, would not heal overnight. The fight for justice, for equality, and for the end of systemic racism would continue. As Talia walked out of the courthouse, the sun now fully risen in the sky, she could hear the faint sound of the city stirring to life. It was a new day, but it was also a reminder that the fight was far from over. There were more battles to be fought, more injustices to be exposed, and more truths to be revealed. Talia knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. The work she had started in Arlington would ripple outward, inspiring others to stand up, to speak out, and to never stop fighting for what was right. And with that thought in her mind, she took a deep breath and walked forward, ready for whatever came next.